Interchange. How does Paul Ryan help Donald Trump? What have we learned from the troubled Tomah, VA? And how does the Sussex firehouse regain the trust of its village? Hello, I'm Mark Segrist, filling in for Dan Jones. Joining us on the panel, Kevin Fisher, a veteran of broadcast journalism and state legislative policy in Madison. Avi Lank, author, former columnist for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. And Gerard Randall is an education and job creation consultant. Rick Horowitz explains a bit later why sometimes all a politician needs is a long holiday weekend. More on that in just a bit. Now, topic number one. The suspense is over. House Speaker Paul Ryan of Janesville says despite some differences, he is supporting fellow Republican Donald Trump for president. There's more common ground, he says, than disagreement. That's the way he puts it. Speaker Ryan says their recent meetings convinced him the soon-to-be Republican nominee will be supportive of the GOP House agenda. It's certainly not a perfect political marriage. Ryan says when he feels the need to speak his mind, he'll continue to do so. So, Kevin, what does Ryan's endorsement do for Donald Trump? And perhaps more interesting, what does it mean for Ryan's own reelection campaign?
Well, Paul Ryan's going to get reelected, all right? He's polling, at least out where I live in his district.
Okay.
He gets about 80%. And now he has more than one person wanting to unseat him. It's a joke. He's going to win. He's going to win easily. Let's put that to bed right now.
All right.
As far as what this does for Trump, does Paul Ryan help Trump? Not that much. This endorsement, and it is an endorsement. When you say you're going to vote for someone, that's an endorsement in my book. It was inevitable, but this was not marching band, cheerleaders, throw confetti kind of announcement. It was pretty tepid, and I think people knew it was coming. But buried in that Janesville Gazette op-ed piece that Paul Ryan, I think, was the key quote, where he said that this isn't about a choice between two individuals. It's a choice of visions for America.
Okay.
And that's his priority. He has to get someone elected, of course, that will stand a better chance of endorsing and approving the House GOP agenda. And that certainly is not Hillary Clinton. He stands a better chance with Donald Trump in office in those regards. But he's the Speaker of the House. His priority is to keep the majority in the House and also get his conservative agenda passed, which he'll announce next week. And it is going to be very conservative, small market, free, a small government, free market, less regulations, strong national defense. So there's going to be disagreement. And I think he left the door open. Look, if you speak out against items that are in the House GOP agenda, I'm going to call you on it. And I'm sure that will happen a lot because Donald Trump is so unpredictable.
Avi, he's worked very hard on putting together this agenda with his fellow Republican leadership. But is it all about the agenda, or does it go beyond that? What's in it for Paul Ryan beyond the GOP agenda?
Paul Ryan is making a horrible mistake here, and I want to say a couple things about Mr. Ryan. Paul Ryan is a rich kid from Janesville who as an undergraduate discovered Ayn Rand and has believed in her ever since. And that's a perfectly reasonable way to be if you're a politician and you have a point of view you want to put forward to the country. And the agenda he's going to announce next week will say that. And reasonable people can talk about it and debate it, and that's wonderful. I think it would be a disaster for the country, but that's my opinion. Slashing Social Security and all kinds of things he wants to do, but that's still within the bounds of political debate.
Right.
David Brooks, the respected conservative columnist for the New York Times, wrote a column about Donald Trump a couple weeks ago, and the lead sentence was something along the lines of, "This is a McCarthy moment for the Republican Party." And he wasn't talking about Eugene, he was talking about the former senator from Wisconsin. Which is to say that while everything Kevin said about probably the reasons Paul Ryan is going along with Donald Trump are true, which is to say if Trump is elected, he's got a much better chance of passing.
You're not going to see them out having tea together.
But this also means Mr. Ryan is supporting a man who supports torture, who doesn't particularly like women, who is against letting Muslims come into the United States, wants to build a wall on the Mexican border.
Ryan is
all of those,
he's
Kevin,
criticized Trump on all of those things.
Right, but he didn't in his endorsement article. He just said the only reason I'm doing it is because he'll do what I want him to do. History will not treat this decision kindly, because what is happening is that the scope of public discussion, things that ought to be discussed as policy in the United States. As I said, a lot of things Mr. Ryan wants to do we can discuss, but banning Muslims from entering the country, building a wall in the Mexican border.
Well, Ryan doesn't want to do that.
But you know what? He's now endorsed a candidate.
Let me ask Gerard if I may.
What choice he has? He has the choice to stand up and say those are bad ideas, and I can't support a man like
bad
this.
ideas.
And then he can say the next thing, I don't support a man like this, and I can't.
To what degree will Paul Ryan's playbook before the U.S. House, become Donald Trump's playbook for election?
Well, it's going to have to become Donald Trump's playbook prior to his going into the convention. I think the key message...
He's taking this seriously. Mr. Trump is taking this seriously.
He's taking it seriously. I'm not a Donald Trump fan.
Okay.
I believe strongly that Paul Ryan has the right vision for the country. All those things that Avi said, I don't think are accurate in describing who Paul Ryan is or what Paul Ryan believes. The important piece, though, is that we move away from personalities and have serious discussions about policy. And right now, the focus, whether it's Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, the focus has been on personalities.
May I ask a follow-up? As you know, since Ryan lost his vice presidential bid, he's worked very hard in researching this poverty initiative. To what degree is his poverty initiative for America being embraced by other Republican leadership?
Seriously and strongly.
Okay, and for what reason?
Well, I think first he's gone around the country and he's had listening sessions with all kinds of folks. He had several listening sessions in Milwaukee with people that were in the room that you'd never believe would be in the room, that have been leaders of organizations, both nonprofits, government, that have the responsibility of responding to eliminating poverty or removing people from poverty roles. I thought that was, first off, one of the most unique things that any leader in government has been able to do to set a national agenda. And those issues were responded to very well, not just by the people in the room, but by Ryan himself.
And we have to move on, and thanks, guys, for your patience with me on this important topic. Successful politicians, you know, really know how to work that 24-hour news cycle. It's like knowing when to jump aboard one of those merry-go-rounds. For maximum coverage, it's best to catch a ride when it's all cranked up. But as Rick Horowitz explains, when a critical issue isn't going your way, there's nothing like a slow spin, like the news on a long holiday weekend.
Some politicians crave the spotlight for everything they do. Others are more modest. Scott Walker goes both ways. Sometimes it's the big event with banners and flags and cameras. Other times, though, he'd rather do it with the shades pulled down, with everyone's mind somewhere else. That's why he loves those three-day weekends. For instance, last weekend, Memorial Day weekend, when the governor tried the old Friday evening document dump to hide the news about his role in trying to dismantle the Wisconsin idea. You remember the Wisconsin idea, don't you? It's the belief, and it's been around for a century or so with bipartisan support, that the mission of the state's university system is to extend knowledge beyond the campuses to every corner of the state, and that a vital part of the university's mission is the search for truth. Scott Walker, college dropout Scott Walker, wasn't impressed. He wanted the Wisconsin idea gone. When that news first broke, this was last year, Walker denied he had anything to do with it. A drafting error, he called it. Not so much. Reporters dug out some evidence even then that it was Walker's office that had pushed for the changes, not a drafting error at all. So then Walker came clean, right? Of course not. He and his allies in the state capitol tried to push through some new laws, including one that would keep that kind of evidence hidden, that would carve out giant new exceptions to Wisconsin's open records law. And when, you're wondering, did they try this stunt? Funny you should ask. Right before the 4th of July weekend, when everyone was thinking cookouts, not conspiracies. Except that the proposals were so outrageous that they couldn't sneak them by. The media outcry, the public outcry, even after a holiday weekend, was just too loud. They had to back off. And eventually, after a lawsuit, after delays, even more documents had to be released, with even more evidence of how Wisconsin's own governor was the one trying to cripple the Wisconsin idea. Naturally, Walker and his PR whizzes tried to sneak those documents out on the Friday evening of a holiday weekend. He clearly hoped that it'd be old news by the time the new week, this week, rolled around, that people would be distracted and would give Scott Walker's latest lying a pass. Nah.
Thank you, Rick. We appreciate it. Now, on to discussion topic number 2. Now we know just how troubled daily care at the Tomah, Wisconsin VA Medical Center had become. Over-medication and abuse of authority were part of the administrative culture for nearly a decade, despite efforts by patients and workers to alert authorities that according to an investigative report by the U.S. Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs. Speaking at a congressional hearing, the nation's top VA administrators took public responsibility this week for the conditions that led to the deaths of at least 2 patients at the Tomah facility. And they say corrective measures are underway to change that culture. My question, Gerard, you have worked at the VA in Washington, D.C., a Walter Reed Medical Hospital.
Correct.
You understand the culture. How did this happen?
What's even more troubling is now that it has taken place, there doesn't seem to be an effective approach to addressing the problem. When the Veterans Affairs Secretary spoke and kind of dismissed wait times as part of the experience that people are just going to have to deal with, that to me was troubling, because evidently he hadn't gotten the message that people are very frustrated by the wait times. The idea of providing vouchers so that people who have illnesses that they want to have immediately addressed can be able to go to local hospitals that will accept those vouchers seems to be slow in implementation. So there are, I think, a number of things that came out in the report. A very damaging aspect to it is that the prior report that had been issued didn't seem to have a lot of credibility to it.
Yeah.
And I think that piece in and of itself speaks to either a dismissive attitude that's taken by the leadership in the administration, or an attempt to cover up even more what the situation is that really exists in our efforts to respond to veterans who are in need of care.
Yeah.
So it's troubling still all the way around.
Right.
And I don't know that the response, even after these hearings from the administration, has been adequate to give people comfort that a true fix is on the horizon.
Avi, government has been slow for years through various conflicts of war to the VA, to the veterans in terms of health care and other social outreach. Why is it just such a chronic problem?
Well, part of it is the tendency of any large institution to be self-protective. You know, we had what was going on in Arizona with wait times, where the line employees were cooking the books so that the people who were in charge didn't really know what was going on.
It blew the lid off the whole.
Well, yeah, but one suspects that this is going on a lot more places than just there. And what happened in Tomah was so patently tragic that it was hard to ignore. There's a couple of points I'd like to make about this. One is, I think, and you will be startled to hear me say this, but thanks to Senator Ron Johnson's efforts, among others, it's possible that a fire has been lit under the people at the VA, and they might actually take some steps to change the culture so that whistleblowers don't feel like they're going to be stifled. I also think that Senator Johnson has been statesmanlike in not really trying to politicize this as much as it perhaps could be. And I hope that the people who support him, the independent groups, will follow that lead, because it seems to me this is too important to try and, there's enough blame to go around that to try and make it a political football is just going to be counterproductive. What needs to happen is the culture needs to change on the ground. The people in Washington need to be able to trust what they're hearing from their folks in the field. And people in the field who want to use the internal methods of bringing these problems to the attention of the people who can fix them ought to be able to understand they work in a system that values that, and that by doing it, they're not going to be putting a torpedo into their career.
And Kevin, this report is coming out at the same time that there's continued discussion about regionalizing county VA services. Is that a step in the right direction, in your opinion?
You can't remain with the status quo.
Yeah.
And you talked about, I think you used the term self-protective. It's very, very true.
Most
in this
bureaucracies
case.
are.
Boy, where do you begin? I haven't read the whole report, but Senator Johnson says it's damaging and deeply disturbing, especially when you get into all the components that just make this such a tragedy. The misconduct and the abuse and the retaliation, and like you, I don't know if I hold out much hope for improvements.
Well, not with this administration, because you've only got a few months left.
But
And
they
so
can-
I think they're just buying time. There's no seriousness about addressing this problem from this administration. If they were serious about it, they would have done it 4 years ago when the administration began its second term. And nothing has happened.
I concur.
I think
Ryan
that's a little,
Honnell-
I think that's a little harsh.
Well, I mean, my goodness,
It's clearly evident.
Yes. What has the administration done about this? Nada. And Ryan Honnell, the original whistleblower here, doesn't hold out much hope, and I tend to agree with him. He says, look, you've got a situation where you have an agency that continues to get tons and tons and tons of money, all right? And they crank out an inferior product, an inferior service. But as long as the money keeps funneling in, they're not going to want to change.
Right.
And yes, the VA is self-protective. They've got 53,000 practitioners employed all across the country. Their union represents many of those workers who are going to resist at all costs any attempts to bring in more competition, more private conveyors of health care. They're going to fight to the death. So we're not going to see much change.
Kevin, you have a local hospital organization. Just a second. You have a local hospital organization advertising now for veterans.
It's been an embarrassing week for the Village of Sussex Fire Department, one of its own. 47-year-old Thomas Gerstner was arrested for driving while intoxicated, while driving a fire truck, that is, and hitting a parked car in the process. The firefighter's license was also expired. It happened during a Memorial Day event. Gerstner, a 19-year veteran of the department, has since been placed on leave and since then has now resigned. This is no laughing matter. It's clearly a crisis management moment for the department. So, Avi, I have a question for you. What does the department have to do now to win back the trust of the Village of Sussex?
Well, we need a lot more information on this. And that would be the first thing that has to happen. We don't know exactly why this gentleman was driving the truck. We don't know. We will presume for this discussion that he was intoxicated. He's only been accused of being intoxicated. But we don't know if that's because he had been at some Memorial Day event and then...
But we do know it was poor judgment exercise. Within that context of poor judgment, how does the department win back the trust of the property?
Well, the first thing is they answer those kinds of questions. They let the people know precisely what happened. And then they talk about whatever policies they have. For example, this gentleman's driving license was apparently expired. What kind of policy do they have to find out?
Right.
You know, you're driving a fire truck. Do you have a valid driver's license? There's just too many questions here. The primary thing they got to do is make all of this public so that the people in Sussex can know what it is that the fire department is offering them and under what kind of terms and conditions.
Both of you guys have managed people throughout much of your career.
I did too.
And you did too. When a situation like this happens, a crisis moment, how do you react? And what do you owe, especially if you're a public servant, what do you owe the outside?
First thing that happens, and the key theme going through all of the topics we've discussed so far is trust.
Yeah.
One of the things, though, that makes this particular situation a little more vexing, we live in a far more litigious society now. My guess is that there's going to be a lot of litigation that will result from the firefighters, whatever action is taken, disciplinary action that's taken
From
with
this
him.
specific
from this
situation.
specific situation. believe me, there have been lawyers knocking at his door saying, we'll take your case, we'll make sure that this doesn't have the outcome that they want it to have. And then, of course, you've got a governmental unit where people perceive there to be deep pockets. Fortunately, no one was injured in all of this. But can you imagine what would have happened in that situation? There's also some policy issues that I think will have to be addressed. And one of those is, how do you get the information that you would need if you require someone to have a valid driver's license? Is there some type of tickler that government agencies can have access to that would allow them to know when immediately someone's license that is revoked or suspended, when that happens, so
in this case, it was said it was expired, which is a little different, because revoked or suspended is a public record. Expired just happens.
Well, even if it's expired and you're required to have it, then
what's the procedure for checking it?
Exactly.
One of the sad parts of this story is that volunteer, whether it's paid volunteer or volunteer, especially in smaller communities in Wisconsin, I mean, they put their lives on the line.
Absolutely.
Just like full-time professional firefighters do. And it's tragic that the Sussex firehouse right now has to operate under this.
Well, it became a story because it does involve someone in a position of, law enforcement or firefighter.
Trust.
Yeah, the story becomes elevated. And there are a lot of unanswered questions, and I just put it in the proper. He did resign.
He resigned.
Yes, he resigned yesterday.
So by doing that, he actually takes Sussex off the hook.
Yeah.
Because they do not have to make the painful decision about what to do if this person goes through the legal system, pays his fine or punishment or whatever the case may be, and then what do you do with that individual who gave 19 years to the department and from what we understand was clean. All right.
19 years, I'm sure he had some heroic moments.
And I don't deal with what ifs, okay? I deal with what happened. And again, I don't condone what happened, but the parked car that he hit, no damage to it. The fire truck, minimal scrapes or scratches. No one was hurt. You know what really jumped out at me in the story is that he and his colleagues that were on their way to the location of the Memorial Day ceremony, they reported it. He reported the accident with his fellow firefighters. He wasn't trying to hide anything or cover anything up. And how is it that if the arresting officer detected that he was inebriated, was under the influence, why didn't his fellow firefighters notice and say, you know what, I don't think you should hop on that fire truck?
Our last segment is quick but important. Former Green Bay Packers great Brett Favre never played at Miller Park, but his farewell tour makes an interesting major stop in the Valley this fall. They're calling it the Thanks for the Memories Dinner. And the September 17th event is not cheap. $250 a plate, includes tasty ribs, some Q&A with the great one, and a parting gift. We don't know what that gift is. The proceeds are going to Favre's Foundation. Favre for Hope, certainly a wonderful cause, one that provides assistance to breast cancer patients and underserved and disabled children. But Miller Park is just the latest in a series of Brett Favre tributes that have included Lambeau Field, Camp Randall Stadium, and the ultimate honor this August 6th in Canton, Ohio. Too much Brett Favre love or not enough, Kevin?
It's enough. It's good. It's a good thing. And I don't think there can be enough because of who you're talking about. You're talking about Brett Favre. And I was on the side of the fence when he was going through that thing. I want to retire, and he was crying, and then he wanted to come back. I was for Brett Favre because I just believe that he wanted to play, and he kind of got a raw deal at Green Bay. So what did he do? He moved on and always played his guts out, especially for the Packers. Played hurt, played well, and I don't think people have forgotten that, and that's why, a la the Rolling Stones, his tickets for the Canton, Ohio Hall of Fame ceremony sold out in minutes. So I think, look, people are still sending tributes out to Bart Starr.
And quickly, Avi, you going to pony up for that ticket?
Don't mention anything about hockey. We're talking football.
The Stanley Cup is going on right now, and you're a straight man here, Kevin. About Favre, yeah, I agree. The man deserves all the honor and respect he can get. So does hockey. The Stanley Cup is on right now, and when it is over, somebody from Wisconsin will have the name engraved, and so will somebody from the University of Wisconsin, because on the Pittsburgh Penguins you have Phil Kessel of Madison, Justin Schultz, who played for the Badgers.
Come on, Mark, get control of this program.
And the captain of the San Jose Sharks is Bill Pavelski, who was on the Badger team that won the national championship.
Avi,
the Stanley Cup
control
is
yourself, will you?
for your hockey benediction at the close of the show. We're most grateful. It's been a pleasure sitting in for our friend Dan Jones. He'll be back next week. You guys have a great weekend.
Yeah, you too.
Bye-bye for now.